Hi, everyone, and welcome to your final week of technical writing. This is going to be your last required lecture. I'm going to try something a little bit new for this course. It's going to be a kind of challenging lecture, I think, that's going to cover a lot of space, but time and space. But I wanted to do it because in the rationales I've seen from this class, and then also some of the feedback I've gotten in emails and some of your communications has been that we wanted to learn a little bit more about science writing, and we wanted to learn, or at least we enjoyed learning in the past about history. And so I wanted to give you a little bit more of that. And so I'm going to replace some of the content from the syllabus with this lecture. And then what we'll do is we'll have two short assignments and two easy discussion posts for you. The reason I want to do that is that the term actually ends on Thursday the 8th. And so what I'm going to do is this week will end on Friday the 9th. So get all of your assignments in, the two assignments, two discussions by Friday night this week. For those doing the syllabus assignment, you can have until Saturday night. But then Sunday, I'm going to have to start grading because your final grades are due the following Tuesday. And so we're running out of time a little bit. And so I'm going to condense this to one brand new lecture for me, and hopefully it'll give you some interesting content about science writing, which is something I consider to be technical writing, but I'm open for debate on that as well. And so I've been working on this one kind of actually throughout the semester since we started doing the reflections, and since I started hearing from you all and reading the discussions, I started to want to put together this lecture, and so I kind of put aside all day today and mapped out exactly how I wanted to do it, and mapped out all of your assignments. So here's science writing. I'm going to try to cover about 525 years of history in about 20 minutes. So it's going to be a lot of content here, but at the end, I'm going to get to an important piece of science writing today. And what I'm hoping is that the assignment I've devised that ties to that portion of the lecture will give you the chance to reflect on all the different things we've said about technical writing throughout this course. So it'll ask you to think back to the original lectures that covered things like worthwhile content, sensible organization, powerful visuals, and then also things like contrast, headings, bullet-pointed lists, readability, and accessibility. And so I'm going to give you this big, wide scope of science writing, and then a piece of science writing that is very current, and then I'm going to ask you to tie together kind of the entire course. One last thing on that I will say is that I particularly wanted to do this because I know a lot of times there's questions in university courses about, am I really going to use this in the real world? Hopefully throughout this course, you've discovered that technical writing is everywhere. You're definitely going to use it in the real world. But the way I'll tie this all together and then tie the course together at the end of this lecture is not only will you use it, but it's also a tool that can make a very powerful impact, not only in our lives, but in history and also in politics and important advancements in the present for us. And so let's get started with this question. Where did science writing come from? And so I'm borrowing from my colleague, Stephen Hurd, who I don't actually know, but I'll put a citation down below for his book, where he talks all about science writing. And so he starts off by asking kind of this similar question: where did science writing come from? And he says that it comes from the early modern period, which is about the year 1500, Common Era in Europe, which is the period you'd be thinking like right after the Enlightenment. So maybe in high school you remember reading about the Enlightenment and people starting to think about how they exist in the world, how their politics should exist in the world, what natural life has to do with human life, and all these similar kind of questions. And so out of that, we get the early modern period, and that would be the period where there's all kinds of exploration around the world by Europeans. It's a very complicated history of conquest, imperialism, racism in some ways, and how it pertains to science writing for sure. is that we see new fields of study come into existence. And so with exploration of the world by Europeans, and again, we know now that this is an imperial conquest really of the world. And part of that conquest is that they're stealing artifacts from around the world. They're bringing them back to Europe and they're displaying them, maybe not in formal museums quite yet, but they are sending them back home from all around the world. And so as these artifacts start to be transported to Europe, there has to be a way to document them. There has to be a way to talk about them. And there has to be a way to display them. And so we might be able to say that's kind of the earliest pieces of scientific writing, where instead of making up myths about the objects around us or making up religious stories, we start to actually think about provenance, what's true, how we can explain it, and even maybe the beginnings of audience-centered kind of communication, like how do I take this strange object and communicate it to people who are just not used to seeing it. We also see alchemy change to chemistry. So alchemy is kind of that maybe older form of almost pharmaceuticals or something like that, where you think of people mixing up different substances, trying to transform matter into something new, making up different kinds of elixirs and things like that, that when we look back now, we know it was probably all just kind of random guesswork. But from there, we get the actual standardized field of chemistry, where people are thinking about uses for the different substances and things around them, and they have to start to know in a systematic, really clear way what happens when we mix different kinds of elements together. And so chemistry starts to develop. Astrology turns into astronomy, although I guess we still have astrology now. But again, instead of thinking about myths that tell us about the sky or tell us why stars move, we see in the early modern period the rise of the fields of astronomy and physics, where again, things need to be systematized. We need to be able to prove them time and time again, instead of just have some kind of interesting guess about what happens. And so with this development of knowledge, you start to see society kind of develop in the same way. Instead of individual hobbyists writing all kinds of different information and different opinions on ideas they have, you see the development of universities and professional societies, where people are working together and trying to, again, really systematize language and make it appear coherent and structured, kind of no matter where you're reading it. In this case, probably reading in the imperialist languages that come out of Europe. But some of the universities that developed, the earliest ones you might be familiar with, Harvard and Yale in the US, of course, and William and Mary, all some of the earliest colleges and universities. I threw in our very own there, University of Delaware. That brings us kind of to the end of the early modern period, which wraps up around 1750. And so that's a very condensed idea of what that period means, but that's why we have science writing, right? We had to start thinking about ways to explore facts, articulate the facts we found, and share them to move human knowledge forward. And again, it's a complicated history. It's capitalist knowledge, it's industrial knowledge, imperialist knowledge, but that's sort of the way history went, and that's why this need for really clear science writing came to exist. Here's where I'll go over a large piece of history really quickly. But from this, from this foundation, it's easy to see how we get the industrial revolutions, right? Knowledge is now systematized in writing. People can pick it up and read it. It'll be factual in every case. In the first industrial revolution, it's applied to what sticks out in my mind, textiles. So people need to know how to combine which fabrics and use which kinds of machinery in a precise way that makes the same thing over and over again. In the second industrial revolution, I think the most of steel, and we need to have steel that's made in really good ways and is communicated every single time, so that we build railroads that cover the world. And then we get the world wars, which we talked about in the history of tech writing. But again, now we need all this mass production. And when we're doing mass production, everything has to be systematic, everything has to be factual, everything has to be communicated really clearly for it to work over and over and over again in the same way. And then from those periods, again, I'm moving very quickly. But we go into the age of the Cold War, at least in the US, and superpower politics, where science writing becomes kind of really important for the state. Both Russia and the United States, but other countries around the world want to figure out nuclear energy, nuclear power, nuclear weapons. And it all needs to be kept secret from everybody else. So we start figuring out ways that we can systematize writing so that it serves the needs of the state, and getting ahead in the idea of superpower politics. And that brings us up to now, right? We have the age of the internet and the age of AI, where none of this could work without people really explaining in-depth stuff about electronics, in-depth stuff about communication. And the age of AI, again, it needs to be replicated again and again. And so really good, clear science communication and how to do it is really important. And so that's like the big history in maybe 5 minutes, 10 minutes or less. But that's why we learn lab reports today. We still need to be very systematic about where our existing knowledge came from, what we did with that knowledge that's new in our experiments, and then what else we can do with that knowledge. And so if you've ever read a lab report or haven't to take a science class, you'll recognize that format. So Stephen Hurd says there's 3 things to know about science writers and science writing. I'm sure if you asked him, he would say there's much more to know. But here are 3 things he does list in his book. He says, first, science writers aren't born geniuses. And so this goes along with kind of a theme of my course. If you've noticed, I continually ask you to return to Canva. I continually ask you to return to the earliest lessons in this course, like making lists, using headings, using contrast. And the reason I do that is I really think that really good technical writing, and Stephen Hurd is going to say really good science writing, actually just come out of practicing and doing it a bunch of times. As you learn more, as you experience more, your ideas will naturally get better and better. But as long as you continue to practice those techniques and you can communicate it really clearly each time, in an accessible and readable way, that's really how your writing ends up, getting to the top of society and being on the top of everybody's mind, is because, you've had all these good ideas, all these good experiences, but you've practiced and practiced and practiced on the format to make it accessible. He says the goal of all scientific writing is clarity. I'm going to come back to that in just a second because he adds a little depth to that discussion as well. And he says science writers must reflect on their writing. And so, I share that to also say, I think tech writers do the same thing. We need to look back on what worked and what didn't work and question why we used contrast and why we used a list and why we use these techniques in order to get better. I think when we think about reflecting on writing, we think of like poetry and literature and art and how a novelist, has to write and rewrite and figure out how to tell a story. But technical writers and science writers, I think, really are the same way. So here's science writing today. A lot of this comes from Stephen Hurd, but I'm going to build on it, and then I'm going to take it in my new direction, which will set the stage for your final assignment. But okay, so he says that clarity over mere rhetoric is more important in science writing. I put mere rhetoric in there because we've used rhetoric a lot in this course. I don't know if I've been really explicit about it, but in this case, I'm using the word the way some people say it. When somebody says a bunch of stuff, but they're not going to follow through, somebody sometimes says, that's just rhetoric, to mean he doesn't mean it. And so we associate that with kind of flowery language. We associate it with really big words. The really clever people who use those words, you kind of have to go and look up. But Hurd here says, no, that's not what science writing is about anymore. And maybe you remember reading stuff from like the Enlightenment or the early modern period in your high school. And sometimes you can't even understand the words because they're just trying to use the biggest words, the smartest words possible. And Stephen Hurd says, no, now we have to use the most clear words. And sometimes what that also means is using shorter sentences, easier words to understand. And that makes your science or this new piece of knowledge you're trying to advance actually clear to your audience instead of, hidden behind all these words that it would need a specialist to look up. So there you can reflect on our conversations about expert audiences and non-technical audiences. Herd says we should focus on process over product, but I put product versus process here because I think it's still kind of a debate. People do ask for really clear products, and sometimes don't ask as much about your process. But there still is this big debate over which part's the most important. I do have a slide that's next. I borrowed this one. If you're gonna think about our technical writing, you'd say this slide's a little out of place. It doesn't fit with the other ones, but that's because I took this one from Dr. Eddie Bruno Essien, he lectures at Charles University, which is in Prague, Czechia, and he shared this on LinkedIn. So I felt like I could bring it up in my class, but I think in some ways we still do think about the rhetoric of what we're saying, and we do think a little bit, maybe too much about the individual words. He gives a list of what does he say? Words and phrases to avoid, right? You can't use these. Try not to use always, never, in conclusion, impactful. These debates do still exist about some of the really small, detailed parts of language, which again get into that kind of mere rhetoric, or little grammar rules and things like that. And as you noticed from this course, I haven't taught technical writing in like a Grammarly way. We haven't sat and thought about where do commas go, what's an introductory clause, do we use it before independent clauses? We don't really talk about that as much anymore, but again, like you saw in there, there still are tips out there. So within science writing, within tech writing, there's still kind of this balance we're striking. So we'd say the genre itself is still developing in a lot of ways. But most of the time you'll see science writing in journal articles or lab reports. For those of you who are in the sciences, you might have heard this format before. I'm rad, to use I guess dated slang now, but it stands for introduction, methods, results, and discussion, which is that whole process I just mentioned earlier of I have my existing knowledge, I have this thing I'm going to do with it, and here's what you might go and do with it moving forward. We think about the audience for those being really expert audiences. When you're publishing those, you're writing for other scientists. Maybe if you want to stay in higher ed, you'll be writing for your colleagues who might want to give you a job or give you tenure one day. And so that's one place you see science writing. Another place is in popular publications. You've probably heard of Nature and Popular Mechanics. You can kind of still see these around in bookstores. Maybe they're not as popular as they once were, but the audience there is a little bit different. Usually the readers of those are kind of more magazine readers who need a little bit of introduction on the science that's a little bit more accessible, but it still is science writing. And then you can also think of just popular books. I think some of the ones I know are like Nonsense on Stilts is one, and Neil deGrasse Tyson puts out, kind of popular books that people can access and read and start to understand science or physics. And so we see science writing in a lot of different ways. And then lastly, you see it a lot in grant applications. And this is where I kind of enter. In addition to being an instructor here at the university, I spend the rest of my time pretty much helping in the research development office, helping the scientists here at the university write grants. And so in some ways, I consider myself a science writer in that domain, but I've never really lectured on it. It's something I kind of practice and don't really reflect on all that often. So maybe I need the advice covered here. But we see a lot of science writing and grant applications. People want to get a grant for various reasons. They want to get a grant to support more graduate students in their lab, to buy new equipment in their lab, and these kinds of things. And so just to give you a really quick background, is that a lot of these grants come from the federal government. You've probably heard of organizations like the National Science Foundation, the Economic Development Administration. These places are really interested in making sure U.S. society continues to develop and advance in the ways it has in the past, and really keeps up its competitiveness in the world. And so wanted to pause quickly here to say, with all of this out there, that's why I wanted to give you the foundation and the history of science writing to start with. As you saw when I gave that quick kind of history, science writing was always interested in developing new fields, developing new processes. Like I said, during the Cold War, it was about getting ahead of other countries. It was about having the better equipment, the better scientists, the better knowledge. And that really hasn't ended, although I think we might say the Cold War ended. It's up to, I'll leave that up to your history professors and your political science professors to give an opinion on. But even though we don't live in that same world anymore, the advancement of science through science writing is still really important to society as we know it. And this, again, is why I told you at the beginning, I wanted to tell you all this because you will see science writing, you will see technical writing in your work. But again, like everyday technical writing, it does kind of shape the world around us. And I wanted to give you a present example. So this is from 2022. So there you are. I've brought us all the way from 1500 Common Era up till today. So there's my 500 and some years of history. And I wanted to introduce you to this program that I got to work on just in a very small, minor way. So don't take me as over exaggerating here, but I did get to be involved in a small way. And it was a program called Tech Hubs, and I'll provide you a link and everything for this information because it's tied to your assignment for this week. And Tech Hubs were developed by the U.S. federal government through a law called the CHIPS and Science Act from 2022. And basically what that law said is we're going to set aside some money and we want to find places in the United States where there's enough resources to specialize in a very specific technology. And what we're going to do is give that region money in order to help them synergize or bring all these resources together. And we're going to hope they create a ton of jobs. We're going to hope they move society forward. We're going to hope they move science forward, everything forward, by just giving grants, giving money that has to be applied for to these areas. And so here's just from the Economic Development Administration's website. They say the Tech Hubs program aims to strengthen U.S. economic and national security with investments in regions across the country, with assets and resources with the potential to become globally competitive in the technology and industries of the future. And for those industries, companies, and the good jobs they create to start, grow, and remain in the United States. And so again, you can hear that really important political kind of language, that important science language, that important technology language. And most importantly for our class, and what I'm going to ask you to do this week, is that it created a science writing boom. There's a whole website with all the applications for these Tech Hubs, where pretty much all of these people had to write 10 pages each and then tons of supplementary documents to say why they're the best place for this money to go. And there was so much of it because the law in the first place authorized $10 billion in funding for the program. And so there was a lot of money at stake. There was a lot of science at stake. And it all had its roots in what I talked about at the beginning of this lecture, which is, we had to systematize knowledge. We had to move society forward. And again, I know those words are kind of loaded in the sense that they imply a very white and Western European interpretation of society, which is definitely true. But that's where it came from. It still really heavily inflects reality today, and it's still really important. And so what I'm going to ask you to do in your assignment is to read one of these applications. They're only 10 pages. You don't have to read all the supplementary material. And I'm going to ask you to practice some of the things we've talked about. Some of you, if you've been active in the discussions, have seen me talk about the importance of summarizing information and why a summary can make a really good piece of technical writing. And then I'm going to ask you to use the skills that I've given you and that I've let you practice and helped you practice throughout this course to analyze these applications. I want to know, are they actually good science writing? You learned in this lecture that it prioritizes clarity. I'll definitely want you to think about if this is clear writing. You've learned in this course that we need worthwhile content and sensible organization, like we talked about, and then those small things on the word level, like contrast and headings. And so that's my science writing bit. That's my history bit, trying to play to some of the things I've seen people really enjoy in this course. And then that project where science writing is today with Tech Hubs. I'm going to ask you to tie it all together and come up with some last analyses and definitions. And again, that's just one very small perspective of science writing because like I said, I see myself as doing it a lot more than being somebody who really teaches it and reflects on it all that often. So yeah, that's your final lecture. I'll put some of the other material up as optional if you want to catch up on what genre studies are and maybe some of the artificial intelligence stuff, which might need some updating. But that stuff will be totally optional. So this is the last time you'll hear from me in this medium. It's been a really great pleasure to work with you all. I hope you get a lot out of this last week. And yeah, you've just been a really stellar class to work with. I'm going to send you some emails over the next couple days just to remind you about timelines and deadlines. And I'll definitely give some grace. I see there's some people with some late work, which it is a short time period. We have just 5 weeks, so I know it's tough when small things happen. So yeah, I'll give some grace to get caught up on things. I'll look forward to how you do with this new assignment. I'm going to ask you to reflect in one of your discussions, and so if you hated this lecture, if you hated this assignment, please let me know. It's brand new, and I'll know for the future if we're going to use it. So thanks so much. I appreciate all your time listening to these, and yeah, just all of your attention in the course. It's been great. Thanks, y'all.